Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for today's lecture, we are going to discuss African Americans after Reconstruction. Now, this will be a three-part lecture series. This will be a three-part lecture on African Americans after Reconstruction, and really we'll pick up and we'll cover the developments as they pertain to African Americans after the election of 1876, after Hayes was elected to the presidency, and after he decided to end Reconstruction. And to begin with, let us do our recap to discuss when we last to just touch on what we discussed in our last series of lectures. So in our last lectures, we discussed settling the plains and all of the ingenuity and the challenges that the early settlers on the plains had to exhibit. We also discussed the end of the native conflicts, how Little Bighorn proved to be a sort of illusionary victory for the natives. On the one hand, they were able to attain this great victory, but that great victory led to increased persecution, increased campaigns from the United States government. And of course, the corrupt bargain or the compromise of 1877 hangs over our lecture for the next three lectures. Now, in the years immediately following the end of Reconstruction, African Americans were able to leave the Redeemer states. Went on to build better lives. Many headed west in the hopes of building better lives. The Exodusters movement saw thousands of African Americans leave the former slave states, the now redeemed states, and head to Kansas and Nebraska, where they were able to use the Homestead Act of 1862 to stake land claims. Now, the Exodusters were not the first African Americans to head west. As we discussed in previous lectures, the first non-natives to explore the West were the Spanish explorers. And one such explorer was a man named Esteban, who journeyed throughout what is now the southwestern United States in search of the famous El Dorado. Now, another African American to explore and to settle in the West was a man named Jean Baptiste Pont du Sable. And he settled in what was then the Northwest Territory. He established for himself a reputation as a fur trapper. He even took a Native American wife, and he built for himself a cabin on the southern shores of Lake Michigan at a spot known to the local natives as Chicago. Now, my pronunciation, I'm fairly confident my pronunciation is off, but it's Chicago, Eschikago, the land of the wild onions, and it was alternatively known as Shikawa, onion or garlic field. Many interpreters say there was garlic field, not really onion field or stinking onions. Becoming in the process of doing all this, he became the founder and the first permanent resident of what would become the city of Chicago. Now, with the Louisiana Purchase, the United States acquired a vast portion of the land west of the Mississippi River, and as discussed earlier, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to chart, map, and explore this new purchase. This new purchase included in this expedition was York, and York was the personal slave, the body slave of William Clark, whose personal contributions included serving as a source of fascination to the otherwise indifferent native groups who were intrigued by his presence. His presence served to smooth over relations with this traveling band and natives, sort of putting in a damper, a break on hostilities. Now, the Bongo family of Minnesota likewise served to really illustrate the presence that African Americans were developing in the Western territories. Starting with John Bongo, who was a former slave. Uh, John Bongo established a prosperous inn on Mackinac Island, and continuing with his son Pierre, Pierre gained a reputation as a local translator and explorer. He would later join the Northwest Company as a guide, and he served as a guide on the British exploration of the Red River Valley. Pierre, like Jean-Baptiste Dupont, he later married a native woman. He married a Chippewa woman. And his son, Stephen, was noted for his role in convincing the Chippewa chief Hole in the Day to negotiate with the United States. But it was to be George Bongo, who outdid them all. He was, like his predecessors, a trapper, a trader, and a translator. And in 1820, he participated in the Cass expedition to find the source of the Mississippi River. It was also George who would sort of immortalize his family's legacy by founding the town of Bongo, Minnesota in 1837. Now, in the wake of the Lewis and Clark expedition came the various trailblazers. Most of them were fur trappers who ranged across the plains and the mountains in search of pelts. Now, a few worked in teams, but most worked alone and interacted with the natives and married native women. Now, among the most famous of the trailblazers was James Beckwourth. Beckwourth began his career in the West working for the Rocky Mountain Fur Company in the late 1840s. And during the California Gold Rush, Beckwourth was ranging in the Sierra Nevada mountains, where in 1850 he discovered one of the two crucial passes through those mountains. He was able to capitalize on his discovery of the path that still bears his name, the Beckwourth Pass. He was also able to establish a farm and a trading post to take advantage of the business opportunities the migrants and miners brought to the area. Now, Beckwourth was not alone. He was not alone in venturing out into California. He was not the first African American to make it to what is now California, or the first person of partial African descent to make it to California. Has noted a number of slaves were brought to California by their owners, but in the rough and tumble gold mining camps and the growing urban centers of Sacramento and San Francisco, escape was fairly easy. Escaped slaves quickly became independent miners, though a few became wage earners for other miners. A few became entrepreneurs, and in the mold of Beckwourth, offered goods and services to miners. Men such as Mifflin Gibbs founded California's first African-American owned newspaper and became a noted civil rights campaigner. Others, like Biddy Mason, became land speculators. And nor were those men the first persons of African descent in California. The last governor of the Mexican province, the Mexican state of Alta California, Pio Pico, was of African, European, and Native American ancestry. Now, the outbreak of the United States Civil War slowed the pace of Western settlement, but after the war, settlement resumed, this time with gusto. This new round of Western settlement brought the settlers into conflict with the various native peoples, the peoples of the plains and the peoples of the Northwest. These wars were carried out intermittently until roughly the end of the 19th century. Really ending after 1877, but carried out in small, isolated, and minor campaigns until the end of the century. Taking part in this bloody, often unjust campaign were African American soldiers. Most were Civil War veterans, and their units soon earned the nickname the Buffalo Soldiers. They earned this nickname from their Native American adversaries, and this was based on the woolly on the way that their woolly hair resembled a buffalo's fur. The Buffalo Soldiers were divided into 4 units, 2 infantry and 2 cavalry, 2 infantry companies and 2 cavalry troops. The excuse me, the Buffalo Soldiers, they provided roughly 20% of all the United States cavalry forces in the American West, in the Western Territory, Western states. And they saw service in the area between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains primarily. Their duties, roles, their duties and roles and tasks were very physically and morally draining. They were given the worst equipment, old saddles, broken rifles, and they were given the worst assignment, the worst area to patrol. These men nonetheless rode across the West, keeping peace between natives and settlers, and rounding up outlaws and cattle rustlers. The Buffalo Soldiers also saw action in the Spanish-American War. They were present at San Juan Hill, where the 9th and the 10th overran Spanish fortifications, enabling Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders to later launch their feigned assault. They provided them with an opening with the channel that they would use to launch their assault. The famous assault on San Juan Hill. The Buffalo Soldiers often also saw service out of the United States. They served in the Philippines, where they helped put down an anti-American rebellion. Their primary duty was fighting natives, and it is really ironic that the 2 most primary events that the Buffalo Soldiers participated in were the putting down of the Philippine Revolt, the Philippine Rebellion in the early 20th century, and of course participating in the 19th century defeat of the Native Americans. It is ironic that that a formerly oppressed group served as agents of oppression to another group. In the course of all these wars, of the late 19th century wars, the Buffalo Soldiers helped to hold Filipinos in a state of second-class citizenship and to dispossess Native Americans of their ancestral lands. They did all this, and they did this in an atmosphere of intolerance that often erupted into violence. Many people were intolerant of the fact that you had African American men in the United States military. A lot of former ex-Confederates were still resentful of the fact that they had lost the war and that African Americans had played a part in the battles. Violence broke out. There was an incident. Brownsville is, I think, the most known incident, but there was another incident at San Angelo. This incident broke out in 1878, where a gunfight ensued between a group of European American cowboys and a troop really of cavalrymen, after a local cowboy murdered a cavalryman for sport. And it wasn't just the enlisted men. Benjamin O. Flipper. He was the first African American cadet at West Point, and he was the first African American to graduate from West Point and be commissioned as a United States Army officer. He was commissioned in the cavalry, and he served with the 10th Cavalry. And his tale is really disheartening. Flipper, who had to endure racist taunts and jeering throughout his years at West Point, he was summarily kicked out of the Army after reports were made that he was seen riding with a white female. So a very tough environment indeed for the Buffalo Soldiers. A very tough environment indeed for them to work in, to live in. But they did. They persevered, and they did the duties expected of them. Now, a few African Americans became notorious outlaws in the West. They became cattle rustlers like Isom Dart, gunman Cherokee Bill, and the infamous con man Ben Hodges. Hodges was known for hoodwinking the president of the Dodge City Bank. He hoodwinked him out of a large sum of money. Uh, but the vast majority of the settlers, of African American settlers onto the out west were engaged in making an honest living. As a matter of fact, in Texas, Texas to be specific, 25% of all cowhands were African American. That is cowboys. 25% of all cowboys in Texas were African American. Several became legends like Deadwood Dick and Bill Pickett. Pickett made a good living as one of the earliest rodeo stars. He even invented the rodeo sport of bulldogging. Now, bulldogging involves riding down the steer from horseback, leaping off the horse, and wrestling the steer to the ground. Deadwood Dick is primarily known for his autobiography. In his autobiography, Deadwood Dick states that he was able to outdrink, outrope, and outshoot any man. Again, you can see the sort of themes for the cowboy really shining through what Deadwood Dick had to say about himself in his autobiography. Most cowboys would say that they were able to do the exact same thing. Now, has the Redeemer governments regained complete control of the southeastern United States, thousands of African Americans turned westward to escape the emerging Jim Crow racism. Heading out to the west offered a much pleasanter experience for them. It offered a much pleasanter existence. The Exodusters, as they were called, were led by many people, but none more admired or impactful as Benjamin Pap Singleton. Now, Pap Singleton used religious revivals to promote this new opportunity open to freed persons in the West. He painted the West as a place where the freedmen could establish themselves and their families in an environment, in an atmosphere far from Redeemer violence and Redeemer racism. The first group of Exodusters were impoverished, having no fear for the boats that would take them upriver from Kansas, from St. Louis really, to Kansas and Nebraska. Now, the migration continued, however. Even though that first group was impoverished and they couldn't really pay the fare, the migration continued. And by 1880, over 40,000 African Americans had escaped from the deprivations of the redeemed states and settled in Kansas alone. In the process, they created new communities, such as Bogue, Nicodemus, Hill City, just to name a few. In the process, they began to rebuild a better life. Now, the Exodusters also moved into Oklahoma, then the Indian Territory, and they swelled the territory's African American population to well over 130,000, building several planned towns that were all African American. The towns included in their ranks places such as Lincoln City, Boley, and of course Langston City. Langston City, one of the great centers, one of the great African American centers in the state of Oklahoma. Then these were all founded as planned towns for African American Exodusters. Now, unfortunately, the effort to build a new community in the West were defeated in the late 19th and early 20th century. Racial discrimination and milling operations and railways, along with drought, brought low prices, low returns for African Americans, and really brought an end to the enterprise. All right, and we will break here with our lectures on African Americans after Reconstruction, and we will return to pick up the pace to discuss more in part 2. And as always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. It's always interesting to get the feedback. So do reply.